Hello there. In 2001, a team of archaeologists and researchers started doing excavations at this small community on the tiny island of South Uist, just off the coast of Scotland. Now, recently around this community, they'd started finding a bit of sort of like archaeological detritus, old pottery shards and different things like that. And there were some 11th century houses there. So the archaeologists started excavating around these houses and under these houses just to see where all this was coming from and what they could find. Well, what they found there was way older than the 11th century. And it turns out underneath these old houses lied the remains of a Bronze Age settlement that they think people first started living in at around 2000 BC. Now, this settlement is distinctive and unique and worthy of talking about just on its own. It was comprised of mostly roundhouses, some of which were interconnected and were also partly subterranean. Not only that, but in a turn that's going to seem, I think, familiar to anyone who may have watched my Burned House Horizon episode, parts of the settlement, parts of these homes, seem to have had a shelf life. For example, look at this three-structure building here, kind of. Or rather a three-module structure. I don't quite know how to put it, but you can see here these three interconnected roundhouses. The central one of this kind of three-part structure is archaeologists' best guess at the most important of them. Now, this central roundhouse right here, every 60 to 70 years was completely destroyed and then rebuilt and modified and changed. New layer of sand floor laid above the old one. And in fact, when archaeologists started excavating the site, they had like 500 years of floor detritus just built up on top of each other. And they had an incredible amount to work through. And I should say it wasn't just houses either. They uncovered evidence of ancient metalworking. They found an ancient Bronze Age cemetery there too. Though I will say this was around the time when cremation started to take off kind of in Europe. So it was like a cremation cemetery, but still they were able to learn a lot from it. And this whole site really, even on its own, was just incredibly remarkable, both for its age and the level of detail that they were able to glean on the everyday life of these ancient Scottish people. The archaeologists would end up naming the settlement they discovered here Cladh Hallan, after a nearby modern-day graveyard. And actually, since we're back on the topic of cemeteries in general, I should say that back in Cladh Hallan today, back in ancient days, it's very clear that their cemetery wasn't the only place they were putting their dead. And now actually we're starting to get to the real reason why I'm talking about all this with all of you and why Cladh Hallan has become kind of famous among archaeologists. If we go back to that three roundhouse structure, underneath these three houses, they would find the remains of 6 people. Now, 4 of them seem to have been foundational sacrifices. People that were sacrificed during the initial first building of these roundhouses to give the structures power or protection. And while that's unfortunate, it's certainly something that we've seen before all over the world, but the other 2 sets of human remains found, now these were something different. And these 2 sets of human remains would end up being so important and so unique that not only are we going to be just focusing on these 2 ancient people for the rest of this episode, but the discovery of our 2 ancient friends here would both A, completely rewrite not just what we know about Scottish history, but European history, and B, also provide the fuel for one of the most fascinating and unique archaeological mysteries of all time. Because these 2 sets of human remains were not foundational burials, and they were not cremations, and they were not any other type of burial ever seen anywhere in Europe at this point. And here, I'll stop the dramatics a bit and tell you that these 2 Bronze Age Scottish people would soon become very well known for a couple of reasons. And the first one is, as archaeologists would soon figure out, when you are looking at the remains of these 2 people right here, you are not looking at the remains of 2 people. And here, let's start with this guy here, this ancient Bronze Age man here. This male skeleton is not one male skeleton. We have the torso and limbs from one man, the skull and neck of another, and the lower jaw of a third, possibly from a woman actually. And if we go look at our own woman again, our own supposed female skeleton, it's just as complicated a picture. The lower jaw, an arm bone, and a thigh bone all came from different people. And data from analyzing the skull was inconclusive. And not only that, but 2 teeth had been taken out of the woman's jaw and put in her hand. So when you look at these 2 sets of human remains right here, what you are actually looking at is some of the oldest and some of the only known ancient world deliberately created composite skeletons ever found. Literally what the mass media have been calling Frankenstein mummies. Which, by the way, we haven't even got to that part. Yes, they are mummies. But don't worry, we'll get into that. We'll get into why we know too that they're intentionally created mummies. And even though I know right now they just look kind of like normal human remains. But first, welcome. My name is Marie. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Bits. I'm so excited to share with you a little bit of the story of the mummies of Cladh Hallan. Now, this place that they were found is fascinating. The remains of these people themselves are incredibly unique and somewhat mysterious, but lately, especially in the last couple years, there's been some good theories put forward as to how we may have ended up with our mysterious ancient friends here. And we're going to look a little bit at the history of the settlement. We're going to look at everything that lets us know why these are mummies. And we're going to see how this one discovery has changed so much about what we know of burial practices in the ancient world. And, this is going to be so much fun. I just realized today I don't think we've ever been to Scotland, except for maybe like in a short or something, never in a proper episode like this. There's so much history there. This is going to be so fun. It's time, it is. It's time for some Scottish bits. We need to understand a little bit more about the island of South Uist itself. As I'm pretty sure you can tell yourself from looking at this map, South Uist is not a huge island. It runs about 20 miles north to south and is only 7 miles across. And while these days it's connected by road bridges and I'm sure boat passage to other parts of the UK, it certainly would have been a somewhat more remote area back in the day when our settlement was being created. And the island itself is somewhat distinctive in its layout. It's kind of split in half. The east side of South Uist is extremely mountainous, with the tallest mountain reaching a staggering 2,033 feet there. And all around these mountains, the east side of the island as a whole is just kind of dominated with heather and peat bogs. The western side of the island, though, has very arable land based off of a shell sand that's built up over the millennia. And while today a lot of income on the island comes from tourism, understandably because of its beautiful appearance, there's also been farming and fishing going on here, and people have been living here in general on this chain of Scottish islands known as the Outer Hebrides for at least 9,000 years. And the people at Cladh Hallan would have also engaged in these practices of farming and fishing and also metalworking. We see evidence of intricate work with bronze, gold, and later iron. And in fact, an extremely rare and beautiful gold artifact was relatively recently found at Cladh Hallan, this beautiful hair ring. And by the time this hair ring would have been crafted, the people at Cladh Hallan would have already been living there for well over 1,000 years. And our mummy friends are tied into all of this, from the cultural complexity angle to the very peat bogs and heather of the landscape, and I mean that literally. The first thing that tipped off researchers to our 2 ancient friends being somewhat unique was after just excavating them and looking at them, realizing that things didn't sit quite right. And actually, it was the composite angle, the mixture of body parts, that was the thing that stood out most first. The woman's jaw didn't fit right. This arm wasn't sitting quite right. Things didn't add up. Though it did take them a couple years, and like I said, it did help getting them sort of out of the ground. It was in 2015 when a professor of biomedical archaeology named Terry Brown from the University of Manchester, just looking at the skeleton, noticed what I just described to you. And he said in an interview later on with National Geographic, the jaw didn't fit into the rest of the skull. It's at this point they started doing DNA analysis on bones in these 2 skeletons to try to confirm or deny what their eyes were telling them, and that's when they figured out the truth. That yes, they were absolutely looking at sort of different people put together. They were also at that time able to specifically date these finds, which revealed two things. First, that the individual body parts even came from different dates. And two, actually it turns out that both of these skeletons, these mummies, were made at different times, though not by a lot. One of these mummies, the oldest, was made between 1260 to 1440 BCE, while the other is a little newer and was made between 1130 and 1310 BCE. So that tells us that this is something that was done more than once and over a little bit of a period of time. And it's from looking at these bones too microscopically that they were able to tell that these were in fact mummies. And not only that, but intentionally created mummies. When our bodies begin to decompose and decay, you can see it obviously in the flesh and the kind of gross aspects, but also in the bones. And when they started examining these bones under a microscope, they could see literally that the pockets of air within these bones that recorded the process of decomposition had been stopped at some point. As they analyzed further, they began to see that something not long after death had halted the process of decomposition, in fact, on both of our two bodies here. The bones also show that eventually this process of decomposition would start up again, but not for a really, really long time. In fact, after their initial death and funerary practice, whatever it was that preserved them, that kept them safe from decomposition, after all this, the forensic evidence shows that they would remain in a state of not decomposing, basically, for 300 to 600 years after their death. And after that point, for some reason, the community seems to have been done with them, and they buried them in the ground where archaeologists would later find them. And at that point, once they were exposed to the highly acidic Scottish soil, the process of decomposition began again. Note the fetal and kind of tightly gathered position of our two ancient friends here. And when these two sets of remains were first discovered, these skeletons were fully articulated, meaning the bones were all connected the way they would have been in life. Combining that with the tight posture and what we know now from the bone analysis, some of the researchers have suggested that the bodies may have originally been wrapped and bound, and it's just because, again, that highly acidic soil, over time, it's broken down the wrapping, and this is what we're left with. And okay, this is all really fascinating and really interesting and really, really unique, but it leaves us with a lot of questions. What did these mummies look like initially when they were finished? How are they preserving them this way? And for why? What were they doing with them above ground all that time? And why did they, in the end, bury them again? Well, as for the preservation part, we do have a good idea now of how that happened, because as they analyzed these remains further, they found elements that could only be traced to local peat bogs in their remains. And now we're pretty sure that what happened is that they would submerge this body in the local peat bog. Now, these bogs are highly acidic, low oxygen environments, which keeps bacteria from growing. The bacteria that breaks down organic matter like our bodies. That's why you see naturally occurring peat bog mummies sometimes, ones that weren't intentionally created by people, like our famous friend here that I'm sure you've seen before. Now, the interesting thing about the natural chemical components in these peat bogs is that they're really good at breaking down some types of organic material and leaving others untouched. So in the example of these famous peat bog mummies that you've seen before, the peat is really, really good at breaking down the skeletal matter. It loves calcium. The acidic conditions love calcium-based materials and will just eat it up. But the stuff in our skin, it don't like that so much. And there's certain natural chemical compounds in the peat that actually do the opposite and can act as a preservation agent for human skin and tissue, basically. So that's how you end up with these peat bog mummies that are beautifully preserved, that you can see their faces so clearly, but actually if you look back at some of these pictures, you can see they're kind of like, and I mean this with no disrespect for the dead, rest in peace my friends, but they're kind of like a blob. I really don't mean that to sound, that sounds awful, but you know what I mean? Like their skeleton is gone, but the outer parts are preserved very, very well, which shows again the deliberate nature of preservation we're seeing here at these Cladh Hallan mummies. For them to get the preserving power of that peat, they got to put the body in that peat bog, and we know they found the residue of that peat bog on the bodies with the remains. But they can't leave the body down there too long, or it would have destroyed the very bones that we're studying now. So what they think they did is they put the bodies down in these bogs for about a year and kept an eye on them. And then when they were ready, so to speak, they would lift the bodies up out of these bogs, bring them back, clean them off, and now you have sort of a perfectly preserved mummy, or in our case a composite mummy, that is resistant to normal decay, it's resistant to normal bacteria, that you can keep with you, in this case for hundreds of years. But why? And also, we still haven't talked about why the different body parts from different people. And actually, let's address those together, because researchers actually seem to be kind of addressing those together, and they do have some thoughts. And I've only really found two good theories put forward, and honestly, one of them isn't even that good, and I hesitate to include it. But the most obvious one that some people originally put forward that is not really getting a lot of ground, but I'll cover it here just to address the elephant in the room. Well, maybe it was an accident. Maybe they lost that dude's head, and so they just grabbed another head and they threw her on there. And that's how we've got this sort of mishmash of body parts here. But, I mean, they did this twice and with multiple body parts. And, well, later on in their local cemetery, they did go back to full body burials. Like I said, for a long, long time, they were practicing cremation. And it's kind of a small community. Like, it wasn't just the 3 buildings we've been kind of focused on. Like, there were more around, but it's not a huge island. Like, how many spare skulls and jaws and arms do they have kicking around? And I'm sorry, if you're going through the trouble to have this year-long process of creating this mummy and watching the body and checking on the body and bringing the body out and cleaning it off from all this peat and preparing it and all this other stuff, are we just playing fast and loose with the heads now? Kind of the most identifying feature in most cultures for a person? Not only that, but again, they did it multiple times. They did that 2 times. And also, if you think about it, like when they attach these new parts, they couldn't attach like fresh parts, because then those would rot. You'd have this perfectly preserved mummy with just like rotting parts sitting in your home or your temple or whatever. You'd have to put on mummified parts as well. So do they just have a barrel of spare mummified parts around in case of whoopsie? Like what? So the main theory that people are going with now has to do actually with sort of how society was changing towards the end of the Bronze Age and going into the Iron Age. In Scotland and throughout the UK, well, what we today think of as the UK, we see societies and communities moving into sort of more clan-based hierarchies, and land and ownership of property starting to pass through clan lineages. And especially with these bodies being out of the ground for so many years before they were being interred again, as if they were on display somewhere and being shown, this could have been both a form of ancestor worship and also a very practical way of maybe making sort of a composite ancestor, you know, like someone that's a bit of body parts of all of your clan, and this like person now, this mummy now represents the family and what that stands for and this whole land holding. One of the researchers working on the site put it really, really clearly and in a really interesting way, and he said, quote, "At a time when land ownership, communal rather than private most likely, was being marked by the construction of large-scale field systems, rights to land would have depended on ancestral claims. So perhaps having the ancestors around, in the flesh, was their prehistoric equivalent to a legal document." End quote. And I will say, I mean, I love that, but even outside of the legal document sense, there's cultures right now where they preserve their dead and bring them out, and so that they can meet with the family members and see them and check in, and for those family members to see them and interact with them spiritually from the beyond. And I mean, I can't honestly say that's what I think is going to happen to me when I die, and I'm not sure that's what I would want for me, but I think that's beautiful. I think that's wonderful. And to be honest, yes, this makes total sense to me on the spiritual level and the practical one. And it makes more sense to me than them being so careless with one aspect of their funerary customs and yet so detailed and having such a rigorous process on the other. But unfortunately, now I have to complicate things again, because when they did the DNA analysis on each of the mummies and looked at the individual bones, they checked to see if the different owners of the original bones were related. So, for example, in the female mummy, if the person with the skull was related to the person with the torso, that sort of thing. And it turns out, no, they're not related. Now, does that mean the whole family lineage idea for these mummies falls apart? I'm not really sure. I mean, we all know sometimes that clans and families, even in modern days, we have our chosen family. It doesn't necessarily have to be through bloodline, but it makes it all the more mysterious and means that this is still kind of an open-ended question of why these mummies were made. I will say, though, that does seem to be sort of where everyone's at now. Most don't buy the accident theory at all, it seems like. Most agree that these are obviously intentionally created mummies made of intentionally put together different body parts from different people. But no one's 100% sure on why. And I will say, too, that all of this research, like them looking at the bones like this and identifying these ancient mummies, has led to a total shift and reevaluation of what we thought we knew about funerary practices in ancient Europe. The same team that made this breakthrough on our mummies at Cladh Hallan later went on to analyze in the same study many other ancient human remains, because again, ours were put back in the ground, so the mummy part kind of just rotted away and we're just left with what looks like normal skeletons. It was just because of the mix-up of the composite parts they thought to check this, but now that they know this, they can go and check all these other remains, guys. So they did. They went and they analyzed a set of 34 human remains dating from the Bronze Age found throughout Britain. And they found, of those 34, 16 showed signs of delayed putrefaction that could hint at mummification. And some of these finds that they went back to because of this study, yes, they showed very clear signs of mummification. In some cases, not from peat bogs either, but from smoking and other processes. And even though we do tend to think of mummies with ancient Egypt or South America or sometimes even ancient China, now archaeologists and anthropologists are starting to accept and understand that ancient Britain was making mummies too. It's just we weren't able to identify them before. The ancient people in Britain were making mummies. And now that we know this, guys, we're going to hear way more about this in the future. There's absolutely going to be more like this. And in fact, there kind of already has. In 2022, researchers published a study analyzing human remains that had been found in the 1960s, but were now being analyzed with fresh eyes. These remains weren't found in Britain. They were found in Portugal. But what's so interesting about them, and this is still contentious, they're still working this through, but there's good evidence, and they actually tested this out on fresh human cadavers, you guys. That's how committed they were to this. That the oldest known intentionally made human mummies are from Portugal, at least as we know it now, because these guys here are believed to be 8,000 years old. This means that they even beat our friends the Chinchurro, and you know how much I love them. And while, like I said, it's still contentious, I'll put some links down below and you can check for yourself. And like I said, there are now many throughout the UK, different sites that are being analyzed for these different ancient mummies. And guys, I can't wait to hear what they discover, but I am going to stop there for today. What do you think? What do you think of our friends at Cladh Hallan? Do you agree with the construct ancestor theory? Or do you think there must be another explanation? I will say I haven't really heard any other theories put forward seriously. I know some cultures will display like their enemies after warfare, but I've never heard of any of them going through a year-long process to do so. What do you think of the other mummies that might be hidden around the British Isles? How many more do you think that could be out there? We're still not sure how widespread a practice this could be, but it's absolutely fascinating. Like I said, let me know your thoughts. And also, please don't let my words be the last words you hear on Cladh Hallan. Just like always, you'll find a full source list pinned to the top comment below, but please don't stop there. And you know, your local library might have a really cool book on the history of Scotland. Or the history on some old other place. It'd be wonderful. You gotta read something new every day, at least a little bit. And not just on your phone. Don't let your phone pick for you. Don't listen to the man. Listen to your heart. You follow your heart. You follow your little heart right to the library. Yeah, that'd be good for you. And when you get back from the library, let me know how you made out. And also, if you'd like to and you enjoyed what you saw today, please consider checking out the rest of my channel, where you'll find lots more unusual and mysterious tales from our past. I do multiple Lost Bits episodes like this every week, and I do deep dive videos once a month. So hopefully I'll see you again soon, but either way, thank you again so much for being here. Be safe, be happy, go with all my love. Until next time, goodbye.